Okay, so last lesson that we would have looked at this week is about casualties and death. So we're thinking about the impacts that casualties actually had on Scotland, and two ways that Scotland chooses to remember the people that were lost in the First World War, and two ways that returning soldiers to Scotland have been supported in the years during the war times sort of end and then since. So in your jotters, please can you put the heading, casualties and death, and then move on with the rest of the lesson. In terms of issue 2, this is now where we are. So we've looked at propaganda, we have looked at the changing role of women, we've looked at DORA, we've looked at rationing, we did conscientious objectors and conscription, and this is the last lesson of issue 2. Reasons why we do it. We still commemorate World War I. It's important to know why we do it and how these memorials came to be, and specifically what it is that we're commemorating. And again, it does come up sometimes in exams about the ways that we remember the dead and about the impact that these deaths ultimately had. So this map here, just as a really quick starter point, think about the number of losses that you can ultimately see, and I want you to ponder, does any of this actually surprise you? Now you might want to zoom in a wee bit on some of these that are a little bit difficult to see, but you can see the numbers on each of the countries about how many people were lost. So you may want to pause the video here and just have a wee look and just have a think about what this would mean in terms of the percentage of the population that was involved and lost as a casualty of war. So ultimately, in terms of Scotland's losses, there were roughly about 557,000 Scottish people who enlisted in all of the services, and of those people, roughly about 26.4% lost their lives. Now, in comparison, there is an average death rate of about 11.8% for the rest of the British Army in the 4 years between 1914 and 1918. Tom Devine, excellent historian on all things Scottish, especially the Great War and Scotland's part in it, he says of the combat nations, only the Serbs and the Turks had a higher per capita mortality rate. Essentially, Scotland as a country lost one of the highest percentages of people. Now this makes sense when we think back to reasons why men joined the war, because Scotland had that really strict honour-bound military tradition, so lots of men joined the war as a result of this, so it meant that there was a higher number of Scottish people in the war, which ultimately would then lead to higher casualty rates than maybe some other places from around the UK. And remember, because this is a Scottish topic, we are focusing on Scotland as opposed to the entirety of the UK. Okay, so despite the fact that the First World War was won, okay, by the Allies and by Britain, it was an absolute human catastrophe on an enormous scale for Scotland, and it probably led to the largest reflective period, the soul-searching period for Scotland and its people. 1 in 4 men who left Scotland to fight on the Western Front didn't return. And then when you consider the number of men who did return with significant physical or psychological injuries or conditions, the impact of the war is then made even more significant. So the end of it is marked by a period of quite serious relief, but also really great sadness. Very few families managed to escape some loss of some sort, whether it be a father, a son, a brother, a husband, a boyfriend, a neighbour, a friend, another family member. Every family in Scotland knew someone who had died in the war or been injured in some way, almost, even if it wasn't immediate family, almost within sort of distance between friends and other people living nearby. The exact number of Scottish war dead is a huge matter for debate. It'll probably never be known exactly, but we do have some rough estimates on this. And this is for a number of reasons. It can be as a general lack of training. So quite a number of these young people went out to fight on the Western Front with only a few weeks training at the most. Obviously disease and the conditions in the trenches we've looked at, which means that a lot of people would have died as a result of this or become injured as a result of this. The new technology that we have looked at caused much more death than any other war previously, and the development of old technology. So artillery, remember, is an old technology but was used very effectively in the First World War, and then things like machine guns and new technology like that were also really effective in dealing with enemies, but were very much the cause for quite a lot of these casualties. Not so much people being killed, but then also people being injured in some way. Gas attacks, which was a new technology for this war, resulted in a lot of people becoming blinded or resulting in problems with their lungs and their breathing or their nervous system, so seizures and things like that that would become problematic. And then you also have things like shell shock to take into consideration. The tactics that were being used that we've looked at, quite often they were inappropriate. Getting out and walking across no man's land, which was really the only tactic that could be used, was not an appropriate tactic for this particular type of war. And it's a war of attrition, so it's about moving forward or trying to push the enemy back, and this leads to you having to get out of the trenches to try and move them, and again a lot of people ending up being injured or killed in that particular tactic. The Scottish National War Memorial has the names of a lot of people who were killed in service to the Crown. If you're in Edinburgh, you can go and visit it. And it's got a roll of honour, so that's everyone of Scottish birth or who had Scottish parents or served in a Scottish regiment. And this is one of the ways that we ultimately try to remember those that had fallen. So we've got these rolls of honour and things like that, and we've looked at the one that we have in the school for those who went away from Webster's during the Second World War. There is also a similar one for the First World War. Now, it's likely that quite a lot of historians have argued that these names, while they are significant in showing everyone who may be identified as Scottish or had Scottish origins or Scottish links, is being memorialised in this way, it's quite possibly an overestimate for those who were not necessarily Scottish themselves but did die wearing a Scottish uniform. So the more commonly accepted figure in history about how many Scottish soldiers died in the war is roughly about 100,000. But a lot of historians have argued that even that is likely to be an underestimate. So it's likely to be somewhere in between that, and we have difficulties trying to calculate those that died as a result of the wounds that they received or of the effects of the gas post-war and things like that. So it's not quite as high as every single name that is there perhaps, though some would argue it should be, and it is not quite as low, some people would argue, as the 100,000. And this is one of the difficulties with actually memorialising the actual impact of the war, because we don't have exact figures or numbers that match all of the records for people that we have at this time. In terms of the Scottish regiments themselves, the Royal Scots lost quite a number of people who came from Edinburgh, so it's roughly about 11,213. The Black Watch lost approximately 10,000 people, and remember, for us the Black Watch is the particular regiment that we would be talking about, because a lot of people from our school joined that one. The Highland Light Infantry again lost roughly about 10,000 men. The 15th Scottish Division lost over 45,000. The 9th Scottish Division had losses of about 52,000, and the Gordon Highlanders lost roughly about 9,000 men. So each regiment was reporting significant losses, and each regiment in their areas across Scotland do have memorials to represent these people, whether it's lists of names or statues or some other way to memorialise them. So, as a quick task, you should have a copy of this diagram from your pack. If you don't, you can download it from the team, or you can just make a copy in your jotter. I would take a double page, and we're looking for some information about the impact on the towns and cities. So we're starting with PALS battalions, we're looking at Glasgow, Dundee, the universities, the Isle of Lewis, the Western Isles, and things, and we're looking for just how many casualties and any other information. So use the next couple of slides to fill in some details and then stick this into your jotter, or draw it in and stick it into your jotter as well. If you don't like the diagram, do it as headings and do it as bullet points, whatever is your preference. Okay, so in terms of PALS battalions, obviously we talked about the fact that in some places, like in Edinburgh, we had Hearts joining the McRae battalion, the teams and things like that. 11 of this team who joined the 16th Royal Scots were killed, several on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, but that would be a massive impact in terms of the PALS battalions and how many people were killed there. Of the Scottish Rugby Internationalists, 30 of them were killed and they joined as a PALS battalion as well. This is probably the highest casualty rate amongst the home nations, so I would add that to your PALS battalion section. In terms of Glasgow, we've got about 18,000 men, which is 1 in every 57 in terms of population. For Dundee, the death toll is roughly about 4,213 out of 180,000. A lot of volunteers from universities were killed in active service as well. And then finally, in terms of the Isle of Lewis, about 1,000 out of the 6,700 would die. So you might want to pause the video here and just use that information to fill in a couple of your boxes. In terms of the Western Isles, okay, there was a significant number of losses here. So in 1911, the population of the Western Isles was approximately 46,732. Their losses are roughly about 1,797, quite significant, which means that they lost roughly about 3.8, so really 4% of the people that were living in the Western Isles were killed in the war. Again, you might want to pause the video there just to fill in this information on your slide. Tolsta, small district on the Isle of Lewis, north of Stornoway, eastern coast. Primary industry was fishing at this point in time. The population was roughly, in 1911, 853, 400 of those are male. By the armistice, so the 11th of the 11th, okay, 1918, they had sent 231 of its men to war and 41 were killed and never returned. So while it's not in the hundreds in terms of killed, it is half of their male population being sent to war and 41 of them not coming back, and that has a massive impact on these people. Tiny community, and again, very much an impact that we'd feel for years to come. So again, you might want to pause the video here and just make a note in the table for that. So you should now have all the information to fill this table in. If you don't, go back and make sure that you've got a bit of information for each of these using the slides that were there. We're looking for the casualties and any just percentages or information, and then stick this into your jotter, or if you've drawn it in, just make sure you've got everything that you need. So, problems that this might cause. Okay, now it's asking you to do this in your groups, but you can do it by yourself, or you can chat to someone if you are speaking to someone. If you think about the problems this would cause back in Scotland, okay, a number of casualties and people knowing all of this. How do we commemorate this then? So towns and villages across Scotland have built memorials, so you might want to put that as a heading and just do a wee bullet point list. So we've built memorials to remember the people that we've lost, and it gives you sort of a common hope that these people didn't die in vain, and this would be the war to end all wars. Now we know it isn't, but at the time they were really hopeful that by having these memorials around, people would see them and realise that this type of warfare didn't work and the losses were considerable. Now while the Second World War obviously does happen and there have been wars since then, none of the wars have been fought quite the same way in the trench warfare, so in some ways it might have actually gone a long way to actually do this. We know that the poppy is quite important, and it's become the symbol of remembrance, and we wear these throughout November, and we lay wreaths at the memorials that are around Scotland on the Remembrance Sunday. Okay, and we've also got the tradition of holding a moment's silence on the 11th of November, and that started in 1919 and is still going on. The Imperial War Graves Commission created and still care for military cemeteries around the world, and the casualties would remain buried where they fell. So there are over 900 of these cemeteries and over 20 memorials to the missing near the front line in the Western Front in France and Belgium today. So again, you might want to pause that and just make a wee note of how we commemorate these things. Now, the problem with grief in general, and you don't have to write anything here, we're just going to look at it, is though as strange as it might seem, there's a lot of controversy over remembrance and commemoration of war. A lot of veterans disrupted the ceremonies in 1918 and things, and protested over what they saw as poor treatment when they came home, so not coming back to jobs or poor housing and things like that. There's also problems with the cost of these things, because a lot of these memorials are quite large, and it's a case of, well, who should pay for this? And that led to quite a lot of arguments as well. And there are debates whether or not these memorials are really worthwhile. A lot of men, when they came back from the front line, did just want to forget the war, and every time they saw these memorials, it became a painful reminder to them, or if you had lost a loved one, it became a painful reminder to you. So a lot of people have actually argued that these memorials are not the best way that we could have done this, and this argument still goes on today. In terms of the aftermath of this, okay, even for those who survived the war itself, many of the soldiers would continue to suffer both physically and psychologically from wounds or from things like shell shock. A lot of men did experience early deaths as a direct or indirect result of their experiences in the war. So, for example, Jimmy Crawford, who was part of the Pals Battalion, and McRae's 16th Royal Scots, was wounded in the hip, and then he died of septic poisoning afterwards. Ralph Armstrong, also of McRae's, was wounded in the face of 1916, and he never recovers, and then he is driven insane by his experiences in the war, and he dies in July of 1925. There are things like suicides being recorded amongst the McRae's veterans because they were on the front line in some of the most important battles, up to 30 years after the war ended, and there are probably more from other battalions recorded there as well. So the aftermath of war was a very devastating consequence. So finally, how do we support veterans today? So in 1921, the British Legion was formed, as well as the Scottish counterpart, the RBLS, and they used the poppy as the remembrance symbol, and all the money from the poppies each year goes towards them. We've got different things happening within schools and in various workplaces to commemorate that, and it is really important that these supports for veterans of the First World War and the war since do continue, which is one of the key reasons that we look at this in particular in this topic. Okay, final task, just to summarise this, I will post a link to this video on the team. Watch it, take any extra notes that you think, and use it just to summarise what we've talked about in this lesson. So that takes us to the end of issue 2. Double check that you've got notes for all of these lessons, use the files in Teams, and then after the holidays we will come back with issue 3.